how the Zanan magazine, through its publications and through the articles, actually many of them came from Mehrangizekar at the time, questioned some of the legal discriminations against women, as well as using examples of what did they mean by these discrimination and violence against women, such as, for example, cases of honor killing, or cases of homeless girls, or many other cases that they used to bring to the attention of the society the state of women's plight in Iran. And that was, I think, very effective. Azadeh's point about the elitist character of these movements, or the elite-based character of women's movement, and later on the green movement, granted. But, of course, in which country in the world the movements for these kinds of democratic rights has not been elite-based? Everywhere that has been the case, including in Canada and in many, in the global south as well. So it was under these circumstances that women came out full force and participated onto the election politics in summer of 2009. Also, I must mention that the campaign for 1 million signatures that Nilufar mentioned had an enormous impact in terms of mobilizing support for women's rights. This is something that she rightly says that unjustly have been criticized, and in fact more recently than before, by some groups outside, that it is reformist and it only focuses on legal rights. But I think you are absolutely right, Nilufar, that mentioned the educational quality of this movement, because by women going house to house, approaching people in the parks, in the streets for getting their signature, they actually mobilized support for women and for women's rights, and they educated people as to what are the issues, and showed to the, for example, going to the southern part and poor areas and house to house asking for women, explaining to them why these reforms in the family law, for example, equal rights to divorce or the custody of children, would affect every woman, not only the middle-class women. An accusation that women have faced everywhere, that what they are demanding actually is only the concerns of middle-class women. During the election, also the role of the veterans of 1 million signature campaign has been very important, because these were the women who, during the pre-election period, I have said it somewhere else, and I really would like to emphasize that in that period, women were strategy setting. And what they did in terms of forming coalitions with other groups within the civil society, they basically led the pre-election period civil society in terms of, and at the same time, I must mention, no other issue had mobilized that much anger and that much indignation as the atrocities that committed against young women on the streets of Tehran. After all, many video clippings that came out of Iran in pre-election period really worked very well in terms of not only bringing to the attention of people the moral corruption of the regime, but also could delegitimize its claim of Islamic values, Islamic kindness and justice. So women, I want to say that gender factor has been an enormous element in the pre-election period. After the election, of course, women joined the movement like many other people in the civil society. That is that they were also fascinated, because what happened after the election no one expected, that people would come out with such force, and day after day, weeks after weeks, months after months, they would stay in the streets of Tehran and other cities, and gradually their slogan of "Where is my vote?" "Ra'y man kojast?" turning into "Down with the dictator" and other slogans for democracy. So this was also very important, because women not only didn't shy away in participating in sometimes very violent demonstrations, violence that was coming from the, of course, the government forces, plain-clothed people, Basijis, so on and so forth. But they as was mentioned earlier by Azadeh, they actually, maybe one can say that the presence of women in this post-election movement to a certain extent actually controlled the level of violence that the regime, despite all the violence that was used, nonetheless, to a certain extent, controlled it. In many cases, we saw that women were actually protecting the young men in particular, but women who were being arrested, beaten up, so on and so forth. So gender really looms large in Iranian politics, particularly after the revolution. In post-revolution, post-election, however, there are some changes that both Kian and to a certain extent Nilufar mentioned, and that is the criticism that comes sometimes much less from within Iran, but more from outside Iran. And this is something that I want to focus on a little bit, because it deeply, deeply concerns me.